Did you, in whole or in part, terminate anyone at the FBI because they worked on the Trump investigation or because they worked on January 6th?
No one at the FBI has been terminated for case assignments alone.
Okay, you're saying alone. Does that mean they were terminated in part because they were assigned to a January 6th case or assigned to the Mar-a-Lago case? You're being very precise here, Mr. Patel. You're saying alone. That means they were fired in part because they were assigned those cases. Is that your testimony?
Absolutely not. But if you want to keep putting words in my mouth,
then
go
let
ahead.
me ask you, let's strip away the word alone.
I don't have to answer your question yes or no because you're setting up a trap so you can have a media narrative.
I'm not setting up a trap.
And I'm not giving it to you.
Imagine applying for the most powerful law enforcement job in America, and the hearing suddenly turns into a courtroom where the evidence is not hidden in a dusty file, but sitting in your own words. That is what happened when Senator Adam Schiff confronted Kash Patel, the nominee to become director of the FBI, inside a Senate confirmation hearing watched like a political car crash in slow motion. The shock was not just that January 6th came back into the room. The shock was that Capitol Police officers were physically standing behind Patel, guarding the same room where Schiff accused him of promoting a song connected to inmates convicted after an attack on law enforcement. And Schiff did not treat that as a talking point. He treated it like a moral exhibit.
It's true that you fired people.
People have been terminated at the FBI who failed to uphold the standards that the FBI requires them to uphold.
Did you tell anyone at the FBI, all FBI employees who they identified who had worked on cases against President Trump would be removed from their jobs? Did you tell that to someone at the FBI?
Say that I would remove people for case assignments?
That people that were identified as having worked on cases against President Trump would be removed from their jobs. Did you tell that to someone at the FBI?
People are not removed for case assignments.
Just answer my question. Did you tell that to someone?
People are not removed for case assignments.
No, you're not answering my question.
And I would
Mr.
never
Patel,
tell anyone.
This was not a normal hearing. This was a stress test for whether a man who wants to command the FBI understands the difference between defending law enforcement on television and respecting law enforcement when it actually costs him something. Adam Schiff framed the issue with one brutal question. If Kash Patel promoted the January 6th prison choir, if he helped raise attention and money around that song, then what due diligence did he do before attaching himself to people tied to violence against police? Patel's answer was careful, narrow, and defensive. He said he did not record it himself. But that was exactly the problem, because Schiff was not asking who pressed the studio button. He was asking whether a future FBI director bothered to know who he was helping elevate. That is where the hearing became dangerous for Patel. Schiff pulled out Patel's own prior words from Steve Bannon's podcast, where Patel had spoken in the language of participation. We captured that audio, we went to a studio, we recorded it, we mastered it, we digitized it. Then came the smallest word with the biggest damage. We. Because in normal English, we includes the person saying it. And if Patel now says it did not include him, then the question becomes simple. Was he exaggerating then or minimizing now? Then Schiff moved from language to consequence, and that is where the room changed. Because the real issue was never just whether Kash Patel personally stood in a studio, touched a microphone, or sat beside an audio engineer while the January 6th prison choir became a political product. That was the small door. The larger question was whether a man seeking control of the FBI can claim respect for law enforcement while promoting something connected to people convicted after law enforcement officers were assaulted, pepper-sprayed, beaten with poles, and left as props in a national argument.
So let me move on. Let me move on to the Epstein files. You said you're the most transparent FBI director in history, so I'm going to put you to the test. In 2024, you were asked by Glenn Beck about Epstein's Black Book. And you said, he asked, who has Jeffrey Epstein's Black Book? And you said, Black Book FBI. And he said, but who? That is, I mean theirs. And you said, oh, that's under the direct control of the director of the FBI. That's what you said. Was that true, Mr. Patel?
I'll rely on you quoting it accurately. I did that a couple
Was it
of years
true
ago.
What you represented to Mr. Beck and the president's supporters out there, or were you lying? Was it true that the Black Book, Epstein's Black Book, was in the possession of the FBI director?
The Black Book was in the possession of the FBI.
Okay, so now that you're the FBI director, you have possession of the Black Book, right?
That index has been released.
That is not a technical issue. That is a character issue. Patel tried to keep the answer narrow. He returned again and again to the phrase that he did not record it himself, as if the entire hearing depended on who operated the equipment. But Schiff was building a different case. He was not prosecuting the studio session. He was prosecuting the judgment. And judgment is exactly what the FBI director job is supposed to require before power is used, before evidence is handled, before targets are named, before the Bureau moves with the weight of the federal government. Then Schiff asked the question that cut through every lawyerly escape hatch in the room. What due diligence did Kash Patel do before promoting the song? Not what did he believe afterward. Not what did he intend emotionally. Not whether he personally supports police officers in a general, comfortable, campaign-safe way. What did he check before lending his name, his platform, and his political force to it? That is the receipt. Because due diligence is not a fancy phrase for elites in expensive suits. It is the basic adult responsibility of asking, who am I standing with and what did they do? If a regular person applies for a job at a local police department, that person gets background checked. If an ordinary citizen wants a security clearance, that person gets screened, questioned, investigated, and measured against details most powerful people would rather skip. So when someone being considered for FBI director says, in effect, that he did no real digging before promoting a song tied to January 6th inmates, the problem becomes larger than one bad interview. It becomes a preview of how casually power can be wrapped in loyalty, branding, and political performance. That is when Schiff turned the room into a moral scene. He told Patel to turn around. Behind Patel were Capitol Police officers, the same kind of officers whose colleagues were assaulted on January 6th, the same institution whose bodies were used as a wall between Congress and chaos. Schiff did not ask Patel to look at a chart. He did not ask him to read a memo. He told him to look at human beings. And that mattered, because Washington loves to turn pain into vocabulary. January 6th, law enforcement. Political violence, convicted offenders, clean phrases, smooth phrases, phrases that make broken bones sound like a committee topic. But Schiff dragged the abstraction back into the room. He said, look at them. Look at the officers guarding you today. Look at the people whose profession you praise when it helps your answer, but whose trauma becomes inconvenient when it touches your record. That was the moral trap, and Patel knew it. He refused to play the scene the way Schiff wanted. He said Schiff's accusation was an abject lie. He said he had never accepted violence against law enforcement. He said he had worked with those men and women. And yes, that response had force, because no nominee wants to be branded as someone who excuses attacks on police. But the unanswered question still sat there. If Kash Patel never accepted violence against law enforcement, why was his due diligence so thin before promoting a song connected to people who attacked law enforcement? That is the gap Schiff kept forcing open. Words on one side, actions on the other. Patel wanted the committee to judge him by his declaration of support for police. Schiff wanted the committee to judge him by what he helped elevate when the cameras, the podcast audience, the political movement, and the billboard push were all moving in the same direction. And that difference matters, because support for law enforcement is easy when the officer is a slogan. It becomes much harder when the officer is the injured colleague of someone your side decided to turn into a fundraising soundtrack. That is why this moment hit harder than a normal confirmation exchange. It exposed the ugly bargain underneath the performance. A nominee can say he backs the blue, can say he respects the badge, can say he made no money, can say the purpose was to help families in need. But none of that erases the central question. Before promoting it, did he care enough to know exactly who was singing? And that is where the hearing moved from emotion into evidence. Because Schiff was not simply saying, Kash Patel said something controversial. He was laying out a chain. First, Patel testified that he did not have anything to do with the recording. Then Schiff produced Patel's own prior words from Steve Bannon's show, where Patel described the project as something we captured, we took to a studio, we mastered, we digitized, and we released. That is not a small contradiction. That is the kind of contradiction that matters when the person speaking wants to run an agency built on interviews, sworn statements, intent, memory, and credibility. The FBI does not live in vague vibes. It lives in words. It lives in the difference between I did, I knew, I helped, I promoted, and I had nothing to do with it. So when Patel tried to turn we into some floating group word that somehow did not necessarily include him, Schiff pounced on the absurdity. And honestly, he should have. Because if a regular witness tried that same trick in an interview room, no serious investigator would just nod and move on. They would ask the obvious question. When you said we, did you mean yourself or not? If yes, why are you minimizing your role now? If no, why did you present yourself as part of it then? That is the problem with semantic gymnastics. They look clever for about 5 seconds, then they start looking like smoke. And smoke is exactly what an FBI director is supposed to cut through, not manufacture. Then Schiff widened the frame again. He moved from the January 6th song to Mar-a-Lago documents, declassification, and the dangerous fantasy that classified material can be treated like a campaign prop. The question was simple enough for any citizen to understand. Did Kash Patel claim that Donald Trump declassified the documents? Did he actually know that? Was he present? Did anyone check whether releasing sensitive material could endanger sources, operations, or lives? That is not some bureaucratic technicality. That is the red line between political loyalty and national security. Before classified information is exposed, responsible leaders ask what damage it could do. Who could be burned? Which source could be identified? Which foreign partner could lose trust? Which person somewhere in the real world could pay the price because powerful people wanted a talking point? Patel answered carefully again. He said Trump had issued a declassification order for a large number of documents. But Schiff pressed the phrase, Patel did not want to own all the Mar-a-Lago documents. That distinction matters. A large number is not all. A declassification order is not a magic wand. And public confidence cannot survive when people close to power blur those lines whenever the facts become inconvenient. This is the core of the case Schiff was building. Not one mistake. Not one bad phrase. Not one heated exchange. A pattern. On the January 6th choir, Patel wanted distance from the recording, but credit for the promotion. On the word we, Patel wanted the benefit of association without the burden of ownership. On declassification, Patel wanted the force of Trump's authority without the full responsibility of proving what was actually declassified when it happened, and whether the agencies responsible for the documents were consulted about the risks. That is why this hearing was not just loud, it was revealing. Because the FBI director does not get to be slippery as a survival skill. The FBI director has to be precise because precision is the job. When agents write affidavits, precision matters. When prosecutors rely on bureau work, precision matters. When citizens are investigated by the federal government, precision matters. So if the nominee for that job answers basic accountability questions by shrinking his role, stretching his past words, and hiding behind narrow definitions, the public has a right to ask what kind of leadership that would create. Then came the transparency test. Schiff asked whether Patel would support the release of relevant grand jury testimony and sections of the special counsel report that touched on his truthfulness. That was the cleanest possible trap, because Patel had spoken the language of transparency. He had positioned himself as someone who wanted sunlight, disclosure, and accountability. But when the sunlight moved toward his own record, the answer became legalistic. He said he supported following the law and providing whatever the law required. That sounds responsible until you compare it to the bigger performance. When transparency helps attack an enemy, it becomes a crusade. When transparency tests your own credibility, suddenly it becomes a process question. And that, more than anything, is what Schiff wanted viewers to see. And this is where the hearing stopped being about one nominee and became a warning about the whole system. Because the FBI is not supposed to be a trophy given to the loudest loyalist in the room. It is not supposed to be a revenge machine, a branding tool, a podcast extension, or a shield for whichever political camp happens to win the next election. The FBI has the power to investigate citizens, handle classified evidence, protect sources, pursue corruption, and decide when suspicion becomes federal pressure. So when Kash Patel sat there under Adam Schiff's questioning, the issue was not whether Patel could survive a hostile senator. The issue was whether his answers showed the discipline, restraint, honesty, and moral clarity required for a position where vague language can ruin lives. In my view, the most important part of this exchange was not even the yelling. It was the gap. The gap between saying, "I support law enforcement," and failing to show real due diligence before promoting a song tied to people convicted after violence against law enforcement. The gap between saying "we" on a friendly podcast and then acting like "we" became mysterious inside a Senate hearing. The gap between demanding transparency from others and becoming suddenly cautious when the transparency points back at your own truthfulness. That gap is where public trust goes to die. And once public trust dies, every investigation looks political, every prosecution looks personal, every classified document fight looks like theater, and every federal agent on the street pays the price for leaders who treat credibility like a costume. That is the real lesson here. Power does not only become dangerous when someone openly abuses it. Power also becomes dangerous when someone keeps redefining his own words until responsibility disappears. Adam Schiff's questioning forced one uncomfortable question into the center of the room. If a man cannot give a clean answer about what he promoted, what he knew, and what he meant by his own words, should he really be trusted to lead the FBI? And if that question matters to you, hit like, drop your comment, share this video, and subscribe for more hearing breakdowns where the receipts matter more than the performance.